Here's what I'd like to do for the demonstration. We're going to set up a DHCP server and use the helper addresses to get our traffic to that server. The network that we're going to use is very similar to this here. I have F00 configured on network 10.0.0/24. F01 is on 192.168.0.0/24. And then over someplace else on the network, I have a DHCP server at 172.16.1.68. Now, the reality is that my network looks much more like this, where my router that has all of the devices connected to it looks exactly as I described it. We're just going to use a DHCP server as a Cisco router. So I'm going to just configure another Cisco router, but we're going to configure it with two DHCP pools. And then we'll use the helper address to forward our traffic to the DHCP server we configure on the router. Do I have to configure the DHCP server on a router? The answer is no. You do not have to configure the DHCP server on a router. You can configure DHCP servers on other devices like Windows and Linux. For the purposes of this demonstration specifically, just this demonstration, we're going to configure that DHCP server on the router. If I open up my PC's command prompt and I do an IP config, right now I have no IP address. Well, I do have an IP address. It is the 169.254 address, which is an address that we know means that it's auto-configured and probably not working right. The DHCP server is definitely not configured yet. Let's go look at the configuration on my router. So I'm going to connect to the console port of my router. Right now I'm connected to the first router, router A. So we'll log in there. If I do a show run, I have fast Ethernet 00 set up as we described. I have fast Ethernet 01 set up as we've described. I'm using serial 000 to connect to the other router. And then I am running OSPF. And I'm running OSPF so that I can exchange all the information I need to and have a complete routing table. The DHCP helper address will not work if I don't have an IP path to it. Meaning, if I do a show IP route on my router where I'm going to configure those helper addresses, if I cannot reach the IP address that I'm going to configure as the helper address, my whole system will not work. Right here, I do have my helper address. We can see in my routing table, my helper address is listed here. If I send a ping message to it, we get a response, meaning that I can ping the DHCP server from my router. I'm not going to be able to ping it from my workstation because my workstation doesn't have a properly configured address, nor does it have a default gateway configured. The whole point here is to use that helper address to get our traffic to the DHCP server so that we can get IP addresses then on our workstations. Now, router A is configured properly up until the point of the helper addresses. Before I go configure those helper addresses though, let's jump over to the other router, which I'm calling router B. And on router B, we need to set up our DHCP pools. So here I am on router B. Looks like it auto jumped me into config mode. Right now, I do not have any DHCP server set up and there are no bindings. So let's start by setting up the server. So we'll move to configuration mode. Ideally now, before I set up my DHCP server, I want to tell the router which addresses to exclude. Now, in the last demonstration I did, I waited until after I configured my DHCP server to add those excluded addresses in. And in this case, we're going to have to do it beforehand. The reason is that since we're configuring a DHCP server on a different device than the router that our hosts are connected to, we have to tell it to exclude the default gateway IP address on that router. Otherwise, what will happen is our DHCP server can end up handing out the 10.0.0.1 address, which is already assigned. So we're going to say IP DHCP excluded addresses. We're going to say 10.0.0.1, and we'll issue that same command again, and we'll do 192.168.0.1. Now we definitely will not hand out those addresses in our DHCP process. Next, let's set up our two separate DHCP pools. The first pool we'll set up, IP DHCP pool. We're going to call this one, we'll just simply call it 10.0.0.0. We'll say that the network, 10.0.0.0/24. We have our DNS server at 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4. We have our default gateway, which we call the default router, 10.0.0.1. There we go. We have our first DHCP pool created. Let's create the second one. IP DHCP pool, this time 192.168.0.0. Network 192.168.0.0/24. DNS server, same thing, 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4. Next, we'll set up our default router. This time is 192.168.0.1. Because if my IP address that I'm handing out is 192.168.0. something, my router for that network is 192.168.0.1. My two DHCP pools have now been configured on my router. Now I can go back to router A and set up my helper address. I'm going to move my rollover cable back to router A. And now what we'll do is we'll start to configure those helper addresses. So we'll go into config T, interface fast Ethernet 00. Let's do a quick check to make sure that that's the right interface. Do show run intf00 just to make sure we're configuring the 10.0.0.1 interface here. If I look on my PC, even though I've configured those scopes, I still do not have an IP address. Let's add in that helper address, IP helper address, and specify 172.16.1.68. And once I do this, now when my workstation sends out the DHCP discover message, I should get an IP address. And I may have to do an IP config/renew to force that to happen. And hopefully with this process, what will happen is my request from my workstation will be forwarded onto router B's DHCP server, and I'll get an address here. I'm going to hit Control-C there. It doesn't look like anything was happening. Let's check it again. We'll do IP config, and then we'll say release. And we'll try IP config again /renew and see if that helps. One more time here. Let's see what happens. IP config. Oh, look at that. There it finally popped up. It looks like it just needed some time. And here we go. We get IP address 10.0.0.3 with a mask of 255.255.255.0. If we do IP config /all, we can see here that our DNS servers 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4 have been configured. It looks like it's listing our DHCP server as 10.10.10.2. Why is it listing that instead of 172.16.1.68? Well, I did some trickery here on router B that I'll show you in just a second. But 10.10.10.2 and 172.16.1.68, those are both the same device. So we're getting our IP address from that router. If I jump over to router B and we do a show IP DHCP binding, we'll see now that my workstation has an IP address. Looks like I handed out two IP addresses here. I'm not sure who received this first address, but I did receive a second address here coming to my workstation. How do I know that's for my workstation? Well, we can compare that MAC address. If we ignore those first two numbers, the last numbers here are the MAC address of my workstation, which show up right here under the physical address. Let's move that to the side so you can see. So we end in 70A5, 70A5. So we have that scope working. Let's go back to router A and make that scope work now for the 192.168 network. So I'm going to move back to router A. We're going to go into interface fast Ethernet 0/1. We'll do a show run INTF 0/1 here. This interface is configured for 192.168.0.1, which is what we want. We'll add in our IP helper address of 172.16.1.68. which will get us over to the DHCP server. Now, if I move over to router B, we can take a look at the DHCP binding to see if our DHCP server worked for our other network. So we'll do that. We'll say show IP DHCP binding, and sure enough, we handed out an IP address of 192.168.0.2 to another workstation in our network. If I now go to my workstation's command prompt, I should be able to send a ping message to 192.168.0.2 and get a reply from it. And what that's telling me now is that my DHCP server is correctly configured, my helper addresses are correctly configured, and now I have the resources to have a centralized DHCP server instead of having to set up DHCP servers all over our network.